Ladies and gentlemen, the top 7 most dangerous hobo camps in America. No law enforcement, no medical help, no escape, only survival. Between 1929 and 1941, America was a nation in collapse. The Great Depression didn't just destroy the economy. It shattered lives, stripped identities, and left millions wandering the land in search of something they might never find again: purpose, hope, and survival. Factories that once hummed with life went silent. Farms turned to dust under the relentless sun. And entire families were forced to abandon their homes, climbing aboard slow-moving freight trains with nothing but a blanket, a tin can, and a dream that somewhere, someone might still be hiring. What emerged from this human disaster was something few historians ever fully describe: a shadow nation that lived between the rails and beneath the bridges. They called themselves hobos, and their world was vast, brutal, and invisible to the America that still lived in towns and cities. These were not beggars or drifters by choice. They were men and women, veterans, laborers, mothers, sons, driven to the edge by hunger and circumstance. When the banks closed and the jobs vanished, the railroad became their last road of freedom and their only escape route from starvation. But that road came with a price. Along those steel lines, stretching from Chicago to San Francisco, from the industrial East to the barren plains, a new kind of society began to form: makeshift communities built from scrap metal, old tarps, and burned-out rail cars. By 1932, historians estimate that more than 500,000 hobos were riding the rails. They slept in coal yards, under trestles, and in abandoned boxcars. Wherever the trains stopped, small encampments began to appear: crude, smoky clusters of tents and fires known simply as hobo jungles. These jungles were unlike anything America had ever seen before. They were not temporary shelters. They were full-fledged micro-civilizations, with their own hierarchies, rules, and social codes. Every camp had its boss, usually a seasoned traveler who had survived years on the rails and demanded respect, often through intimidation. Others worked as lookouts, scavengers or cooks, bartering meager meals for protection or news of safer routes ahead. At first, these camps were built from necessity. People needed warmth, food, and companionship in a time when the world had forgotten them. There was strength in numbers, protection from the weather, from trained police known as bulls, and from rival drifters who stalked the tracks like predators. Around the campfires, stories were traded, stories of lost jobs, broken families, and distant cities rumored to have work. For a moment, under the flicker of dying flames, the hobos could almost imagine a sense of belonging. But the illusion didn't last long. As more desperate souls arrived each day, resources ran thin. Food became scarce, tempers short. The weak were exploited by the strong, and the jungles grew darker, meaner, more violent. What began as a refuge soon turned into a battleground. Newcomers were robbed of their few possessions. Fights broke out over scraps of food or a dry corner of a tent. Men vanished in the night and their absence went unnoticed. Disease spread faster than rumors. Typhoid, dysentery, and pneumonia stalked the camps like silent killers. The hobo nation had no government, no police, no hospitals. When someone died, they were buried on the outskirts of the camp. Shallow graves marked only by a piece of wood, sometimes not even that. Their names were lost to the wind, their stories erased by time, and yet more people came. Every day, new faces stumbled down the tracks, gaunt, exhausted, and hungry. They came from every state, carrying the same empty hope that the next stop might be better than the last. Within a few years, these jungles had spread across the entire country, more than 500 camps operating in the shadows of America's railways. Some were small and relatively safe, places where hobos worked together to survive. Others became infamous for their lawlessness, ruled by gangs who enforced their dominance through knives, fists, and fear. Word of mouth became the only map a traveler could trust. A symbol carved into a tree, a circle with a cross, meant danger ahead. A triangle with 2 lines meant food and kindness could be found. To those who could read them, these markings were the difference between life and death. The average citizen never saw this world. Newspapers rarely mentioned it, and when they did, it was always with a tone of contempt. Hobos were labeled as lazy, dangerous, or criminal, but behind those harsh words lay a truth no one wanted to face, that the line separating a citizen from a hobo was paper thin. One lost paycheck, one bad harvest, one bank failure, and anyone could join their ranks. For many, the journey began with pride still intact. They dressed neatly, carried tools, and looked for honest work in the next town. But after weeks or months of rejection, the hope faded. The clothes wore thin, the eyes went hollow, and the humanity drained away. The camps were filled with men who once had dreams, factory foremen, miners, teachers, now reduced to scavenging for scraps in garbage piles beside railroad tracks. In the eyes of the government, they didn't exist. In the eyes of society, they had failed. But among themselves, the hobos created a fragile order, an underground America bound not by wealth or status, but by survival. And though they lived on the fringes, they carried with them an unspoken resilience, a refusal to die quietly in the dust. This was the birth of the Hobo Nation, a forgotten chapter of American history where desperation forged its own form of civilization, and survival became the only law that mattered. It was a world without borders, without justice, without mercy, a world built from the wreckage of the American dream. As the Great Depression deepened, the hobo camps that had begun as desperate refuges started to evolve into something far darker. Entire zones of lawlessness that existed outside the reach of civilization. America's railroads stretched for thousands of miles, cutting through wilderness, swamps, and industrial wastelands. And in those forgotten corridors, the rule of law simply vanished. Police departments in nearby towns rarely patrolled these areas. Local sheriffs saw the camps as someone else's problem. The rail companies, the counties, or the hobos themselves. And for the railroad security forces, known as bulls, their duty was simply protect the trains and the cargo, not the people living in the shadows beside them. Once a person jumped off a moving freight car and disappeared into the brush, they entered another world, one where no badge, no law, and no mercy followed. Inside these territories, survival wasn't a right. It was something you earned. Every hobo jungle developed its own set of rules, enforced not by any written code, but by whoever held power through fear. The strongest men, often veterans of the rails or ex-convicts fleeing the law, rose to dominance. They controlled the best sleeping spots, the cleanest water, and the access to whatever food trickled in. They ran their camps like warlords, demanding obedience from newcomers and punishing those who resisted. Violence became a kind of currency. A man's reputation mattered more than his name. A single act of weakness, sharing food too freely, showing fear, or questioning authority, could make someone a target. Fights broke out nightly over bread crusts, firewood, or stolen tools. Knives, clubs, and sharpened metal scraps became standard weapons. Some carried railroad spikes as both tools and protection, and few hesitated to use them. The authorities knew about these places. There were reports, scattered and brief, of entire camps going up in flames after violent uprisings, of bodies found near the tracks with no identification, of freight cars discovered with blood on the floors. But few investigations ever followed. To the outside world, these people were invisible. Drifters without names, without families, without rights. If one disappeared, no one filed a report. If a dozen vanished, no one asked questions. For those who lived within these zones, trust became a rare and dangerous luxury. Travelers learned to sleep lightly with one eye open, clutching their meager possessions against their chest. Campfires provided warmth, but also drew danger. They signaled where others might find victims too weak to fight back. The crackle of the fire often mixed with the sound of coughing, of whispered threats of footsteps approaching in the dark. Even when local law enforcement occasionally ventured near the camps, they did so with caution. Stories spread among deputies, stories of officers ambushed along the tracks, their weapons stolen, their patrol cars stripped for parts before sunrise. The camps had their own way of protecting themselves, and outsiders, whether police or civilians, were not welcome. In some regions, particularly around Chicago, St. Louis, and Kansas City, entire rail yards became no-go zones. The hobos called them jungles, but in truth, they were fortresses of chaos. Makeshift barricades were built from wooden crates and twisted steel. Lookouts watched from bridges and rail cars. Anyone unfamiliar who stepped inside risked being robbed, beaten, or worse. These places attracted more than just the desperate. They drew the dangerous. Fugitives running from murder charges, gang members hiding from police, men wanted in multiple states for robbery or assault. In hobo jungles, they could vanish completely. With no fingerprints on record, no address, and no one looking for them, they blended in with the masses of the forgotten. Some even rose to leadership, using intimidation and violence to create miniature empires of fear within the camps. The social order was simple, might made right. There were no judges, no jails, no second chances. A thief caught stealing might lose a hand. A man accused of betrayal could be thrown into the river or tied to the tracks as punishment. Justice, if it existed at all, came in the form of revenge, fast, brutal, and absolute. But not every camp was ruled by chaos. Some hobos tried to maintain a fragile sense of community. They formed obo codes, a set of unwritten laws meant to protect travelers. Share food if you have it, respect the fire ring, never harm a fellow wanderer without cause. Yet, even these rules couldn't survive the growing tide of desperation. As the years dragged on and hunger worsened, the few who tried to maintain order were often overthrown or killed by those who refused to follow any rules at all. By the mid-1930s, certain camps had become infamous nationwide. Railroad workers whispered their names like curses. Murder Creek Jungle in Pennsylvania, Hell's Yard outside Kansas City, the Bone Patch near Sacramento. These weren't myths. They were real, deadly places where the line between human and animal had long since disappeared. In these zones, even seasoned hobos refused to stop. They would rather sleep in the open fields, exposed to the cold, than risk entering the territory of a gang-run jungle. The tragedy of these lawless territories was that they existed entirely within the borders of the United States, a nation that prided itself on law, justice, and freedom. Yet entire populations lived under none of those things. To walk into a hobo camp was to step outside of America itself, into a forgotten pocket of time where civilization had stopped functioning. These were the black holes of the Depression era, places where human suffering gathered, where morality dissolved, and where the only rule that mattered was survival. Once you entered, there were no guarantees you'd ever make it out again. By the mid-1930s, the hobo jungles of America had evolved far beyond the ragged camps of the early Depression years. What began as loose communities of travelers and outcasts had hardened into something far more dangerous. Miniature kingdoms of violence and control. The longer the crisis dragged on, the more desperate people became. And in that desperation, power shifted toward those willing to do whatever it took to survive. The first gangs emerged quietly. At first, they were small groups, men who banded together for protection while riding the rails. They guarded each other from bulls, shared food, and split what little money they could earn. But over time, as the camps grew larger and the weak were weeded out, these groups began to realize that protection could also become domination. Fear was more effective than friendship. A single man couldn't control a camp, but a ruthless gang could. They began seizing control of the largest jungles, the ones near major rail junctions like St. Louis, Chicago, and Pittsburgh. These locations saw a constant flow of newcomers, migrants looking for work, lost drifters, or men fresh off the freight cars with no idea what kind of world they just stepped into. The gangs preyed on these newcomers mercilessly. They demanded tolls. A few coins, a piece of bread, a knife, or even a pair of shoes just for permission to stay the night. Refuse to pay, and you might not leave until morning. The camps that fell under gang control changed overnight. Fires were no longer shared freely. Food lines became restricted to those who obeyed. The gangs took over every source of power. The supply caches, the firewood piles, the clean water spots. They built crude fences out of scrap metal and guarded them with sharpened pipes. The leaders, often called jungle kings, ruled with absolute authority, backed by lieutenants who enforced their will through violence. It didn't take long before some of these gangs became notorious along the entire rail network. Word spread from one camp to another, carried by trembling travelers who had escaped with bruised faces and broken ribs. Everyone knew the names of the worst places: Murder Creek, the Devil's Hollow, the Bone Patch, Railroad City, Hell's Yard. Each name carried its own horror story, whispered around distant campfires like ghost tales that were all too real. Inside these jungles, brutality wasn't random. It was structured. The gangs created hierarchies. The leaders at the top controlled the camp's economy, stolen goods, food supplies, and anything brought in by trade or theft. Beneath them were runners, men who scouted the nearby rail lines for new arrivals or potential victims. Below them were guards, the enforcers who patrolled the camp at night, armed with bats, knives, and makeshift clubs. And at the very bottom were the newcomers, the lowest rung in the chain, subject to humiliation, beatings, or forced labor. Initiation rituals became common. In some jungles, a newcomer had to fight another man to prove himself. In others, he had to steal from a rival camp or perform degrading acts to earn a spot near the fire. Those who failed were cast out, or worse. The gangs used terror as a tool to maintain order. They made examples of anyone who defied them. Bodies were sometimes dumped in the nearby woods, hidden under piles of leaves. In the morning, no one spoke of it. Women suffered most of all. There were few of them in the jungles, and their presence often attracted attention. The kind that was cruel and predatory. Some gangs claim women, forcing them into servitude in exchange for protection. Others traded them between groups like property. To survive, many women disguised themselves as men, cutting their hair short and speaking in low voices to avoid detection. Even then, danger was never far away. The gang system turned some hobo camps into miniature versions of the very society that had failed them, ruled not by money, but by violence and fear. Yet, in a twisted way, these gangs offered something that the world outside no longer did: structure. There was a kind of brutal logic to it, a hierarchy that provided a sense of belonging, even if that belonging was bound by blood. For some, joining a gang meant survival. Alone, you were prey. With a gang, you were part of something stronger, something feared. Still, not all hobos accepted this new order. Scattered among the chaos were the free runners, men who refused to bow to any leader. They moved from camp to camp, spreading news, warning others of the dangerous jungles, and leaving coded symbols carved into trees or fence posts. These marks, circles, arrows, triangles, became the secret language of survival. A symbol carved beside a track could mean safe camp, while another might warn dangerous gang ahead. For many, these markings were the only defense against walking straight into death. The rise of the gangs also drew attention from the outside world. Railroad companies began hearing rumors of no-go zones, places even their own security men refused to patrol. Freight theft increased. Trains began arriving at depots with missing cargo or damaged cars. In some areas, gang members raided trains directly, leaping onto moving boxcars at night to steal coal, grain, or goods. The press occasionally picked up the stories, painting the jungles as nests of thieves and killers. But by then, the truth was far more complicated. The gangs were not just criminals. They were symptoms. They rose because the system above them had failed. In a country where millions were starving, these men had created their own governments, their own armies, and their own laws, cruel as they were. They ruled because no one else would. They enforced order because the rest of the world had abandoned these people to chaos. And so, deep in the heart of the Depression, the hobo jungles became divided, half community, half kingdom of terror. For every small group that tried to share food and kindness, there was another that ruled through intimidation and death. The tracks that once symbolized freedom had become arteries of fear, carrying desperate souls straight into the clutches of those who had learned the harshest truth of all in a world without law. Power belongs only to those willing to take it by force. By the mid-1930s, the hobo jungles weren't just dangerous because of violence or gangs. They had become breeding grounds for something far more relentless disease. Death in the jungles didn't always come suddenly from a blade or a fall from a freight car. Often, it came quietly, creeping through the water, the food, the very air the hobos breathed. When hundreds of people live shoulder to shoulder without sanitation, death doesn't need a weapon. It just needs time. The typical hobo camp was a patchwork of tents, tar, paper shacks, and makeshift lean-tos built from discarded wood, tin, and cloth. There were no toilets, no drains, no clean water. The same river that quenched thirst also carried sewage from factories upstream. When it rained, human waste and garbage washed directly into the water source. Within days, it turned into a cocktail of infection. A perfect recipe for dysentery, cholera, and typhoid. People didn't have the luxury of boiling their water. They drank straight from streams dark with oil or rust. The first sign of sickness was usually a fever. Then came the cramps, the vomiting, the endless diarrhea that drained a person until they could no longer stand. In the jungles, there were no doctors, no medicine, no hospitals. A man might lie shivering beside the fire for days until the coughing stopped, not because he recovered, but because he was gone. The bodies were buried in shallow graves near the edge of the camps. Sometimes they were wrapped in blankets, sometimes not at all. A few old hobos took on the grim duty of grave diggers, carving crude wooden crosses and placing them at the head of the mounds. The rain would wash those markers away within weeks, leaving behind only anonymous patches of disturbed soil. Travelers called them hobo fields, silent cemeteries without names, where the forgotten buried the forgotten. Disease spread faster than any rumor. One sick man on a freight car could infect an entire camp by nightfall. Pneumonia and influenza were constant threats, especially during winter. The damp, freezing nights along the tracks claimed countless lives. Hobos wrapped themselves in newspapers, burlap, or old coats scavenged from dumps. When the fires died down, the cold crept in and lungs weakened by smoke and malnutrition simply gave out. Then came the rats. Fat, fearless, and everywhere. They gnawed through food sacks and bit sleeping people, spreading plague, carrying fleas through the camps. Insects swarmed, too. Lice, flies, and mosquitoes bred in the garbage piles and stagnant water. A single infected bite could send someone into fever and delirium. Without medicine, delirium often ended in death. Food was another killer. Most meals came from trash bins behind restaurants or from spoiled goods tossed off freight cars. Canned food was a luxury, fresh food a miracle. People ate whatever they could find, half-rotten fruit, rancid meat, bread crawling with mold. Those with stronger stomachs survived. Those who couldn't adapt were claimed by food poisoning, malnutrition, or starvation. When sickness spread through a camp, panic followed. The healthier hobos would move away, abandoning the infected to die alone. Some camps went silent overnight, dozens dead. The survivors scattering to other jungles, carrying the diseases with them. It was a grim echo of the plagues that once swept medieval towns. Only this one existed in the heart of industrial America. Fire brought its own terror. Every camp relied on open flames for cooking and warmth. but the shelters were built from dry wood and oil-soaked rags. A single spark could ignite a chain reaction that consumed the entire jungle within minutes. There were stories, whispered in the rail yards, of entire camps burning to ash while the people inside were too weak or sick to crawl away. The smell of smoke and burning tar lingered for days, a warning to the next trainload of travelers passing through. Industrial toxins added another layer of death. Many jungles were built near factories or rail yards that dumped chemical waste into the ground. Hobos washed in water laced with lead, mercury, and solvents, unaware that every splash burned into their skin or lungs. The toxic fumes caused chronic coughs, rashes, blindness, and, in some cases, slow organ failure. The unlucky ones who scavenged in factory dumps for scrap metal often found themselves poisoned by what they thought might keep them alive. And yet, despite all this, the jungles persisted. Human beings clung to life even as disease devoured everything around them. Some tried to organize small, hospital corners, sections of camp where the sick were gathered and tended to. Women and older hobos acted as caretakers, using boiled rags, herbs, or crude homemade poultices. It rarely worked, but it offered something medicine could not: compassion. In a world without rules, mercy became its own rebellion. But not all mercy was kind. There were cases, unspoken, unrecorded, where the suffering grew unbearable and a friend or lover ended the pain with a final, quiet act. A knife, a pillow, a whispered apology. These deaths were not born of cruelty, but of exhaustion. The same exhaustion that hung over every camp like smoke. The government knew these jungles existed, but few officials dared to enter them. During the worst years of the Depression, social workers and doctors occasionally visited with charity groups. Many never returned. Disease wasn't the only danger waiting for them. Suspicion, paranoia, and desperation turned strangers into enemies. To the hobos, outsiders were often mistaken for police or reporters who might expose their misery to the world. By 1938, public health officials estimated that outbreaks of typhoid, an influenza linked to hobo camps, had killed thousands nationwide. But no one knew the true number. There were no records, no medical reports, no names, only whispers along the rail lines, stories of jungles gone silent, of mass graves hidden in the woods beside the tracks. To the world above the rails, America was recovering. Factories were reopening, and hope was returning. But below that world, beneath the bridges and behind the freight yards, a silent epidemic had already taken its toll. The Great Depression was ending, but for the hobo nation, the cost of survival had been paid in blood, fever, and forgotten graves. In the hobo jungles of Depression-era America, death didn't always come from knives, hunger, or disease. Sometimes it came from the very environment itself. Sudden, merciless, and without warning, fire, poison, and steel were the silent killers of the tracks. These camps were built in the most unforgiving places, behind rail yards, beside chemical factories, under bridges heavy with smoke and soot. The land was cheap because no one else wanted it. It was soaked in oil, littered with rusted metal, and blanketed in the gray ash of industry. For the people who lived there, survival meant coexisting with danger, sleeping on land that could ignite, drinking water that could kill, and living within inches of locomotives that thundered past like iron monsters in the night. The danger of fire was constant. Every hobo camp had a dozen or more fires burning day and night for heat, cooking, or simply to keep away the rats. They burned whatever they could find. Coal chunks stolen from freight cars, oily rags, soaked wood from train depots, even bits of tar paper torn from abandoned warehouses. The air in many jungles carried a permanent haze, the smell of burnt grease, smoke, and garbage thick enough to choke the lungs. One spark could turn an entire settlement into a furnace. Tents and shacks were built from anything flammable: cardboard, burlap, old crates, or thin sheets of tar. Wind carried embers like bullets, igniting everything they touched. There were stories of men waking to the crackle of fire, trapped in their shelters as the flames closed in. Some never made it out. Those who did bore scars that never healed, reminders of how fragile their lives truly were. The fires weren't always accidents. In some places, gangs set rival camps ablaze as warnings. In others, train bulls or railroad guards would torch entire jungles to drive out their inhabitants. The smell of smoke became a sign, a reminder that nothing in the hobo world was ever permanent. You could build a camp one week and watch it burn to ash the next. And then there were the toxins. Invisible, inescapable, and everywhere. The industrial backbone of America was built on chemicals no one yet understood. Rail yards leaked oil, diesel, and solvents into the soil. Nearby factories dumped waste into rivers that flowed past the camps, staining the water black and slick. The hobos washed their hands in it, cooked with it, and sometimes even drank it when no other water could be found. At night, the air glowed faintly near chemical plants, a ghostly light that shimmered over the camps. Men complained of headaches, coughing, and eyes that burned for days. Their skin blistered after bathing in contaminated creeks. A few developed sores that never closed. The hobos didn't have a name for it then, but what they were breathing was poison. Industrial runoff from a country racing to rebuild itself while its forgotten citizens drowned in the waste. Even the very ground beneath them was toxic. Many camps were built on landfill sites where railroad companies buried broken machinery, spilled fuel and ash. When it rained, the soil turned to a thick, metallic sludge that stung the skin. Rats fed on the garbage, spreading disease through every tent they crawled into. Yet no one left. There was nowhere else to go. Still, nothing terrified the hobos more than the trains themselves. The very machines that gave them freedom, shelter, and death in equal measure. To ride the rails was to gamble your life every day. A single misstep could send you under the wheels. A slip from the ladder of a moving freight car meant instant mutilation. Those who survived such accidents were often left crippled, crawling back to camp with missing fingers or crushed legs, relying on others to drag them to safety. Every hobo knew the sound. The long, mournful wail of the whistle echoing through the night. It was both a promise and a warning. The trains brought food, warmth, and escape. But they also brought fire, sparks, and destruction. More than one camp had been flattened by a derailed freight car, the wreckage scattering like shrapnel through tents and fires. There were tales of entire jungles obliterated in seconds. Men burned alive, the tracks twisted into molten steel. Even when the trains didn't crash, they carried their own dangers. Some boxcars were loaded with chemicals, explosives, or gas tanks. When fires spread too close to the tracks, explosions followed, sudden bursts of light that turned night into day and left nothing standing. The hobos learned to read the landscape for danger. They could tell from the smell of the soil if fuel had leaked nearby. They watched the color of the water. If it shimmered with a rainbow sheen, they knew not to drink. The old-timers passed down knowledge the way others passed down prayer. Never camp downwind of the tracks. Never sleep close to a coal yard. And if the air smells sweet, run, that's poison. But knowledge could only protect so much. The dangers multiplied as the depression dragged on. More people crowded into fewer camps. Fires grew bigger, air grew thicker, and sickness became constant. There were no alarms, no safety rails, no fire departments. When disaster struck, you saved yourself or you didn't. Sometimes, late at night, survivors spoke of the jungle fires as if they were living things. Hungry beasts that devoured entire camps and left only smoke and silence behind. They said you could hear the screams echo along the tracks for miles after the flames had died, as though the ghosts of the dead were still riding the rails, warning others to turn back. The Great Depression had turned America's railways into both lifelines and death traps. The trains brought opportunity, but the land around them, the poisoned rivers, the fire pits, the collapsing bridges, became graves for thousands who sought nothing more than a place to rest. For the hobos, the world itself seemed to be fighting against them. Fire burned from above, poison seeped from below, and steel thundered all around. The camps were not just unsafe. They were cursed. Each spark, each puff of smoke, each rumbling train carried the same silent message here. Even the earth wants you gone. In the lawless wilderness of America's forgotten rail lines, survival wasn't a matter of luck. It was a matter of knowing the code. To outsiders, the hobo world looked like chaos, ragged men drifting from one filthy camp to another, living by instinct alone. But beneath the smoke and hunger, there existed a silent order, a secret language of symbols, gestures, and rules that governed life and death on the rails. Those who ignored it often vanished. Those who understood it lived to ride another day. The hobo code was their law, carved in chalk and coal on fence posts, boxcars, and bridge stones. Each mark told a story, a warning, or a promise. A circle with two parallel lines meant safe camp nearby. A cross drawn inside a square warned, danger here. Police are cruel. An upturned triangle meant food for work. A simple skull, drawn with a shaky hand, carried the most feared message of all. Death waits beyond this point. These symbols were the network that connected thousands of wanderers across an America torn apart by poverty. For many, it was the only system of communication they could trust. Newspapers and radio belonged to the wealthy, but a chalk mark left under a bridge could save your life. In the most dangerous camps, this code evolved into something darker, a set of unwritten survival laws born from violence and necessity. No paper, no leader, no court, just rules whispered from fire to fire, enforced by fists and fear. Rule number 1, never steal from another hobo. Food, tools, and blankets were sacred. To steal meant death or worse. In some camps, thieves were stripped, beaten, and branded with hot metal as a warning to others. In others, they were thrown out into the cold night to freeze. Rule number 2, respect the king of the jungle. Every camp had one. The oldest, toughest, or most ruthless man in the group, his word was final. He decided who ate first, who stayed, who left, and who faced punishment. In the larger camps, his authority was absolute, backed by a loyal gang known as enforcers. Men with nothing to lose and no mercy left to give. Defying him meant a beating or a shallow grave near the tracks. Rule number 3, share fire but not trust. The campfire was sacred, a place of warmth and stories. Strangers were welcome to sit and eat, but everyone kept their knife close. Many men told tales of friendly drifters who smiled by the fire, only to rob or stab them as they slept. The hobos learned to sleep lightly, to wake at the faintest sound, the crunch of a foot, the hiss of breath, too close. Rule number 4, silence is survival. In the jungle, talk could kill. Police, guards, and bounty hunters were always listening, always watching. A careless word about a hidden camp or a planned ride could bring down raids that ended in fire and gunshots. The hobos trusted few, and even among friends, secrets were currency. Rule number 5, never show weakness. The hobo camps were full of desperate men, veterans, criminals, runaways, the broken and the lost. Mercy was rare, pity was dangerous. To cry, to complain, to admit fear. These were invitations to be preyed upon. The strong took from the weak. The wise learned to hide their hunger behind a hard stare and a steady hand. The hobo jungles were places without written law, but they were not without honor. Many camps practiced a kind of rough morality. Help a man who's working, punish a man who's lying. Men who shared their last crust of bread were respected. Those who hoarded food while others starved were marked. The good jungles had order, leadership, and a code that kept chaos at bay. The bad jungles, the ones on our list, had only violence, but even the dangerous camps had their rituals. Strange, tribal ceremonies born from the clash of survival and superstition. Newcomers were tested. They might be forced to fight, to steal, or to prove courage by standing before the campfire and telling their story. Those who passed earned protection. Those who failed disappeared. The hobo code wasn't just about safety. It was a philosophy. It taught men to see the world through symbols. A bent nail meant shelter. A dog's bark meant food. The echo of a train whistle at midnight. Freedom or death, depending on which direction you were facing. Some say the hobos had their own religion. Not one of God's, but of journeys. They believed that movement itself was salvation. To stop was to die. To stay too long in one place, even in a safe camp, invited madness. The code taught them to always keep one eye on the horizon and one hand ready to catch the next train. But the most important rule of all, the one that separated survivors from corpses, was simple: never forget where you are. A hobo jungle might look like home, but it wasn't. It was a temporary truce between hunger and despair. Every smile could hide a knife. Every handshake could be a setup. Every friendly face could be a ghost tomorrow. To survive, you had to become invisible, not to the eye, but to the world itself. Move like smoke. Leave no tracks. Speak little. Trust less. Know the code, obey the silence, and never, ever forget out there under the shadow of the trains, no law protects you. Only the rules whispered in the dark. The men who lived by those rules became legends of the road. The ones who didn't became stories told by the fire. There was a saying among the old hobos: the hardest part isn't getting in, it's getting out alive. The most dangerous hobo camps were like black holes scattered across America's railways. Once you entered, escaping their gravity took everything you had. The jungles weren't just places of shelter, they were traps disguised as refuge. They lured the desperate with promises of warmth, food, and companionship, but for many, they became graves dug in mud and memory. Every man or woman who set foot in those camps knew one truth: leaving was the greatest gamble of all. In the dark corners of the worst jungles, the ones outside Chicago, St. Louis, and Sacramento, there were those who didn't want you to leave. Gangs ruled by violence and paranoia feared outsiders who might talk to the law or bring others back to claim their territory. They controlled every path in and out, stationed lookouts near the railroad crossings, and demanded tribute from anyone who passed through. To walk away without permission meant a beating, a stabbing, or a shallow grave near the tracks, and yet some managed to slip away. The survivors learned to move like shadows. They left just before dawn, when the firelight dimmed and the guards grew sleepy. They carried nothing that clinked or shone. No bags, no pots, no tools that could give them away. They wrapped their shoes in cloth to muffle the sound. They avoided the main path, slipping through reeds, crawling under railcars, moving silently toward freedom. But physical escape was only the first step. The real battle was mental. For those who lived too long inside the jungle, the world beyond felt alien. Too quiet, too clean, too full of eyes that looked away. They carried the jungle within them, the smell of smoke, the echo of trains, the constant twitch of fear in the gut. Even after escaping, many found themselves returning to the tracks, drawn back by the strange comfort of chaos. Some said the jungle called to them, a whisper in the night wind that said, "You belong here." Yet there were others, the rare few, who broke the cycle entirely. These were the true survivors. They had learned the unspoken rules of escape, the ritual of departure. First, you earned your right to leave. You helped someone else. Shared food, repaired a tent, defended a weaker traveler. The jungle respected strength, but it also remembered kindness. Those who left after good deeds were often spared pursuit. Second, you left no debts unpaid. Among hobos, debts were sacred. Owe a man food or a favor, and he owned a piece of your soul. Many who vanished trying to escape had forgotten this rule. They left behind unpaid debts, and those debts followed them, in the form of knives and vengeance. Third, you never said goodbye. Farewells were bad luck. They drew attention. They marked you as someone about to leave. And someone about to leave was easy prey. Survivors simply slipped away during the night, leaving behind only the faint impression of footprints in the ash. The hardest part was reaching the rails. The jungles were often surrounded by swamps, barbed wire, or industrial wasteland. Physical obstacles meant to keep people out, but just as effective at keeping them in. The lucky ones caught a slow, moving freight car, hoisting themselves up with the last of their strength. The unlucky ones slipped beneath the wheels. Those who did escape told stories of looking back, of seeing the fires of the jungle glowing faintly through the mist, like a constellation of dying stars. Behind them were the voices of the lost, laughter, shouting, the clash of metal, and then silence. For a moment, freedom didn't feel real. It felt like another trick, another illusion that would vanish with the next whistle blow. But freedom was real for those who earned it. Some made their way to small towns where kindness still existed. They found odd jobs, washed in rivers, shaved, and tried to forget the life behind the tracks. Some even wrote letters to newspapers, warning others about the jungles, though few were ever printed. Who would believe them? Who would care? The Great Depression ended, but the hobo jungles didn't vanish overnight. They faded, swallowed by construction, forgotten by time. Some were buried under highways. Others turned into industrial parks. But if you walk near certain rail lines at night, locals say you can still hear things. Faint echoes of trains long gone, and whispers carried by the wind. The old-timers used to say that every jungle had a spirit, not holy, not evil, but hungry. It fed on loneliness and fear, and it never truly died. Even now, modern freight riders sometimes report strange sights, ghostly fires flickering under bridges, or chalk marks freshly drawn on walls that haven't seen a human in decades. For those who survived the worst hobo camps, life was never the same. They carried scars. Some visible, most not. They had stared into the raw, lawless heart of survival and lived to tell the tale. They had seen what happens when civilization breaks, when laws vanish, and when hunger becomes stronger than morality. In their stories, one truth echoes louder than all the rest. The jungle wasn't just a place. It was a test. It tested your strength, your sanity, your compassion, and your will to live. It revealed what kind of person you truly were when stripped of everything: money, name, family, and hope. Some emerged broken, some emerged harder, and a few, just a few, walked away wiser, carrying the code, the memories, and the warning that would echo for generations. Chua, the rails can take you anywhere, but never forget what they can take from you.